Thank you for joining me for this presentation sponsored by the Anaheim Public Library about the first families of Disneyland. I'm David Koenig. I'm the author of 6 books about the wonderful worlds of Disney that started with my first book, Mouse Tales, a behind-the-ears look at Disneyland, which is a collection of crazy stories from cast members over the years, and has culminated in my most recent book, The 55ers, the Pioneers Who Settled Disneyland. The 55ers covers the hundreds of fascinating performers and shopkeepers, cowboys and Indians, and a handful of scoundrels who worked at the happiest place on earth during its first year. It was a time when everyone who worked there felt part of a family, and Disneyland, especially Main Street, was its own small town. Everyone gathered for coffee at the Maxwell House coffee shop, did their banking at the Town Square Bank of America, and even got their gossip from the monthly cast member newsletter, The Disneylander. In a sense, they were the first residents of Disneyland, but not of this property. No, before the 55ers could move in, and before the Disney bulldozers could break ground, about 15 different families had to move out, some of them who had been there as long as 50 plus years. Now we have this vision that before Walt showed up, Anaheim was like Little House on the Prairie, with farms and orchards and people in overalls calling each other Ma and Pa. Well, not exactly. By 1953, when Walt had selected the site for Disneyland, everyone already knew the freeway was coming, and the farmers had already started selling out. So there were a couple of uninhabited lots, and there were also some city folk who enjoyed country living. They may have had orange trees on their properties, but they paid someone else to take care of them. So let's take a look at the site BW, before Walt. The land was subdivided into parcels of 5, 10, 20, or in one case, 40 acres apiece. This map from 1954 shows the original plots. You can see Cerritos Avenue running right through the middle, with Harbor Boulevard along the right or eastern edge, and West Street, today's Disneyland Drive, along the left or western edge. Along the top is Winston Road. Disney would eventually buy the properties north of Winston Road from the Westland, Ames, Steinbrink, and Ader families, but initially left them as orange groves for long-term expansion. To the left of West Street were ranches owned by the Vandenberg, Fay, and Callens families. The 20-acre Combs plot would become the site of the Disneyland Hotel. It was owned by Friendy W. Combs, the treasurer of the oil well company Termo. Combs was the son of the company's founder, who had struck it rich building oil wells in Long Beach and Huntington Beach. Friendy had moved to Anaheim in 1948 to get away to the country from the crowds of the beach. Here he had acres of orange groves, a spacious plantation home with a swimming pool, plus a 2-bedroom little guest house where his kindly ranch foreman, Verl Casey, lived. At age 48, Friendy agreed to sell his property to Disney, if they didn't kick Verl out of the guest house, and let Verl continue taking care of any orange groves that might remain on the property. So, Disney moved Verl's little 2-bedroom stucco house behind the northern border of the park, behind Fantasyland, where he lived with his wife for the next decade, tending to Disney's orange trees. He was ultimately forced to move out about 10 years later when Disneyland expanded its borders and built It's a Small World where his house used to sit. Friendy Combs' own residence was converted into a temporary lounge for the Disneyland Hotel called The Little Gourmet, in anticipation of a permanent gourmet restaurant opening up at the Disneyland Hotel. Combs' neighbor to the north was Julius B.B. Fay, who 42 years earlier was born on the 10-acre citrus farm his father had acquired in the first years of the century. Fay's modest single-story dwelling was nicknamed the Brown House and used as Disneyland's first personnel office. Most of Disneyland's first cast members were interviewed and hired in the Brown House. Next door, the 10-acre orange groves had been cultivated by 64-year-old George Vandenberg since the early 1920s. Vandenberg's two-story wood bungalow was turned into Disneyland's first training center, nicknamed the White House, where most original Disneyland cast members spent their first day on the job. In the weeks leading up to the park's opening, the Anaheim Police Department and California Highway Patrol took up temporary residence inside. A few years later, the house would be torn down to build a driving range for the Disneyland Hotel. The 20 acres on the opposite side of West Street were owned by the Peltzer family. Charles Peltzer Sr. was a wheat farmer from Kansas. He and his large family moved to Anaheim and bought 20 acres of just planted orange trees and 9 dairy cows, one for each of his 9 children. After his son Victor sold the property to Disney, Victor joined his brother Charles Jr. to start the Christmas tree growing company Peltzer Farms. Today, Peltzer Farms is run by Charles III. Disney used the land for its backstage warehouse and employee parking area and for the far reaches of the rivers of America. The Peltzer home was temporarily used as an office for the construction company that built Disneyland, until they no longer needed it, and it was smashed to smithereens, then set fire to during an after-hours, booze-filled house-wrecking party. The fall property, below, was initially kept as orange groves before being turned into the far end of the parking lot. Most of the parking lot, as well as the entrance to the park, all the way up to Center Street, the first block of Main Street, was owned by the Callenses. The family immigrated to the United States from Belgium in 1885 with their 3 sons, all agricultural entrepreneurs, who settled in Orange County in about 1911. Son Gustav and his wife Alice purchased 40 acres in Anaheim, where they tended orchards and had a cow to supply their own milk and butter. Gustav also raised and raced pigeons. By the time Disney arrived to scope out the property, Gustav had long since passed, and it was owned by his widow, Alice, and their 4 adult daughters, Agnes, Anita, Angela, and Andrea, and their 1 son, Gerard, or Jerry. Alice was still living on the property in their beautiful 2-story Spanish-style home with hardwood floors. Her son, Gerard, who took care of the orange groves for the family, and for a while the pigeons, lived in a smaller house in the northwest corner of the lot. When Disney took over, it kept Alice's house to use as half of its administration building. The 2 10-acre properties facing Harbor Boulevard that were destined to also become parts of the parking lot had long been walnut tree ranches. The top one was owned by the Reed family, who lived off-site but still kept walnut trees on the property. The other was owned by 70-year-old Linus Witherell, who still lived on his land, but after 40 years of ranching, had recently retired and cut down all his walnut trees. Mr. and Mrs. Witherell's cute 2-bedroom bungalow was moved back behind Frontierland to become home of Owen and Dolly Pope, who ran Disneyland's Pony Farm, which supplied horses and donkeys to Frontierland and Main Street. The Witherell/Pope house still survives to this day and was recently beautifully restored and placed near the Team Disney Anaheim guest parking lot just off Ball Road. If you're driving down Ball Road, look just off of Cass Place and you might be able to catch a glimpse of the historic home behind the gates. Above the Reed property, in what would become the hub and the southern half of Tomorrowland, was the 20-acre plantation of Gerhard Claussen, a 90-year-old German immigrant who abandoned his farm in Nebraska in the 1920s to take up roots in Anaheim. Claussen initially refused to sell because his 2 spinster daughters wanted to continue living in the house. Disney finally got them to sign on the dotted line by promising them that if they would sell their property, the daughters could stay. They just needed to move out temporarily because it wasn't safe to remain during construction. Unfortunately, the same night the Peltzer house was wrecked, the Claussen house also mysteriously burned to the ground. If not, the 2 women would have lived their waning years with the TWA rocket to the moon as a lawn ornament. The northern half of Tomorrowland was purchased from 66-year-old Everett Hughes, who had spent the past 40 years tending to a citrus farm he was ready to retire from. The 2 5-acre orange and olive groves destined for Fantasyland were the longtime country homes of friends Willard Olding and Herbert Jarvis, both oil refinery chemists who worked together at Pathfinder Oil. Here, 16-year-old Sally Olding watches as a bulldozer levels the last of her childhood playground, as it had just done to that of her next-door neighbor, 15-year-old Bernard Jarvis. The Oldings' gorgeous 2-story home, made of white stucco, was moved, hardwood floors and all, to the other side of town to become the personal residence of Disneyland's first accountant, Milt Albright. The back half of Frontierland was comprised of 2 5-acre parcels. Since the 1930s, one belonged to Fred Edwards, a citrus farmer advisor with Association Laboratory. The adjacent ranch had been worked by William Holstein, but after Holstein was killed in a car crash, his widow, Lena Fable, remarried and moved off-site, making for an easy sail to Disney. Adventureland and the southern edge of Frontierland belonged to Paul Dominguez, an orange grower formerly with Association Laboratory, whose father-in-law had purchased his 10 acres in 1889. Paul's wife, Linda, was born in their house, as were their 2 children. When the Dominguezes moved out, they bought a new house elsewhere in town and convinced their former neighbor, the Edwards family, to buy the vacant lot next door. So the best friends lived their entire lives as next-door neighbors in 2 entirely different corners of Anaheim. Disneyland moved the old Dominguez house eastward and joined it to the Callens house as the other half of Disneyland's first administration building. But, as an unofficial part of the sale, Disney was to keep this one sentimental Canary Island palm tree, the Dominguez palm, which was planted over 100 years ago by Linda's parents. It continues to blend in perfectly with Adventureland at the far end of the Jungle Cruise boathouse. As another unofficial part of the sale, the park hired Dominguez's son, Ron, as a ticket taker. Ron soon became the park's first Davy Crockett, rose up the ranks, and retired in 1994 as Executive Vice President, the highest-ranking officer at Disneyland at the time. On a side note, Ron Dominguez still resides in Orange County, a living link between today's park and the first families of Disneyland. Thank you so much for joining me. If you have any questions, please contact me through Twitter at Dave Koenig, Koenig. And for more wonderful, never-before-shared stories about and photos of that first year of Disneyland, check out the 55ers. Thank you so much.